Welcome to the 10th lecture in our series on church history called Chronica Catholica. Now, tonight our subject is Charlemagne and the Holy Roman Empire. And it's a very important chapter in European history, particularly interesting one. It's an important chapter for the conclusion of the Dark Age, the emergence of Western Europe out of the Dark Age that began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions. It's an important chapter in the revival of European cultural life in general, and an important chapter contributing to the shape and eventual flourishing of medieval civilization. Important chapter in the sort of birth and development of France and also of Germany. Involves the creation of this new medieval concept of the Holy Roman Empire. And it all centers on this man, Charlemagne. So we're really just going to focus on Charlemagne and his influence and some of the long-term effects of his reign. So, the name Charlemagne comes from the Latin Carolus Magnus, which just means Charles the Great. So his Christian name was Charles, and then he was given the title the Great. And to sum him up, he was king of the Franks, that he inherited through succession from his father. He became Holy Roman Emperor, and that title he inaugurated in the year 800. And after his death, he was basically given the honorary title Europae Pater, Father of Europe, because of his contributions to European civilization. So he could really be considered one of the founding fathers of European civilization, and especially a major sort of founding father in the medieval project of building Christendom, right? This kind of international alliance of Christian societies united by their shared membership in the spiritual society of the church. We could say that in a way that was inaugurated by the Emperor Constantine, but its distinctive medieval shape owes a great deal to Charlemagne. So I'm going to give you basically a narrative of his life, stopping at various points to highlight some of the more interesting things. And feel free to ask questions as we go, and I'll either answer them as they come up or at the end. But Charlemagne is a fascinating and pretty likable man. It's in a way it's surprising that there haven't been any big blockbuster Hollywood movies made of him. But maybe he's just too, he would be considered like persona non grata. I don't know. I'm not sure. He's not very PC in a number of ways, although actually you could say it's a bit complicated. Okay. To set the stage for Charlemagne, I want to kind of rewind the tape back to where we got to around the year 600. So the various Germanic barbarians have parceled out the Western Roman Empire into a series of kingdoms and established themselves as the local lords, to a large extent taking over the Roman administration that they found there. And so France is not a kind of unified territory lining up with the territory of modern-day France, but it's dominated by the Franks, and they are ruled by the kings of the Franks in the dynasty of the Merovingians. So this is our map. The rise of Charlemagne comes with the replacement of the Merovingian dynasty by a new dynasty called the Carolingians. And the name Carolingian is actually named after Charlemagne, but he wasn't the inaugurator of that dynasty. He was the second king in the Carolingian dynasty. So Clovis the first king of the Franks to convert to Catholicism, established the Merovingian dynasty around the year 500. He united the Frankish clans. He carved out territory in much of what's today France, united it under his rule, established a kind of alliance with the bishops of France so that they supported him as king, and he protected them and helped them to some extent in their care for the poor and so on, and established the Merovingian dynasty. And I mentioned that the Merovingians are one of the more kind of savage and brutal dynasties of Western Europe during this time. And the perennial issue was the Frankish habit of splitting up an inheritance among all the sons. They didn't practice what's called primogeniture, where the oldest son inherits everything, and then the younger sons just get little legacies or what have you. They generally split the kingdom up between the living sons at the time of the ruler's death. And so there was kind of perennial civil war among the Merovingians. And then the later Merovingians were given the nickname Les Rois Fainéants, the do-nothing kings. So they were considered sort of weak, pathetic, uninterested in rule, self-centered, and usually basically just incompetent and uninterested in doing much. And so the first of those Rois Fainéants is generally considered Dagobert I in the early 7th century. And these do-nothing kings lasted until the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, who was replaced in 751 AD. So there's actually an amusing French folk song about Les Rois Fainéants. It's called Le Bon Roi Dagobert. I don't think it goes back to the Middle Ages. I think it was composed in maybe the 18th century, possibly a kind of anti-royalist song during the time leading up to the French Revolution. But it's all about the incompetency of the King Dagobert and how his greatest kind of servant is the bishop Saint Eli, Saint Éloi in French. So anyway, it's an amusing song if you want to look that up. I don't know if there's an English translation, but anyway. So under the do-nothing kings, the real power in the realm became an official who was kind of like the king's prime minister, and his title was mayor of the palace, in Latin major domo. And so the mayors of the palace ended up being the de facto rulers of the Frankish realm under the Roi Fainéant, and they are the ancestors of the Carolingian dynasty. Now, the mayor of the palace that concerns us is Charles Martel, who was mayor of the palace in the early 8th century, and he's the grandfather of Charlemagne. So you'll remember, if you listened to the last lecture on the rise of Islam, that Charles Martel led the Frankish forces into battle against the armies of the Caliph, the Muslim armies that had invaded France after conquering Spain. So the Muslim armies conquered Spain. We've got our map of the spread of Islam here. So moving out of Arabia, west through Egypt and North Africa, they conquered Spain shortly after the year 700. And then several armies crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and invaded France. And the northern wing of the army was defeated by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours, also called the Battle of Poitiers, in 732. And the Muslim advance into Western Europe was stopped there. And so he essentially established his kind of reputation through defeating the Muslims and making himself the savior of Western Europe. Now, I'll note that the southern wing was not defeated at that battle, and Muslim raids and invasions of southern France continued to be an issue up to the time of Charlemagne. And so the southern regions of France around the Rhone River, around like Marseille, were subject to depredations and looting and so on by armies crossing in from Spain. So, okay. So Charles Martel raises the prestige of his family greatly through winning the Battle of Tours. And again, he was the real power in Kingdom of France at the time. And he's known also for dominating the church and essentially looting churches and monasteries in order to for valuables in order to fund his armies. Some of the Catholic historians I've read kind of comment wryly on this, like, he would be considered essentially a lay oppressor of the church, but since the valuables were needed to fund the army that defended France successfully, you might consider it basically it was the church's contribution to the defense of the fatherland. But anyway, under Charles Martel, St. Boniface did much of his evangelizing, as well as kind of organizing local councils to build up the church in France and so on. So, okay, Charles Martel. After he dies, his son, Pippin the Short, becomes mayor of the palace after him. And by the way, a lot of medieval people are known by nicknames because there wasn't a custom of having last names at the time. The Romans had their own system of names. It's the famous like 3-name system. So like Cicero was Marcus Tullius Cicero. And but in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, they didn't have any kind of system of last names. And so people were typically known by their first name and then some kind of descriptive attribute, right? So like Charles the Simple, Charles the Fat, Charles the Bald, Pippin the Short, Pippin of Herstal, etc. So Pippin the Short, son of Charles Martel. In the year 751, he, with the support of the majority of the Frankish nobles and the kind of leading families of the Franks, he replaced the last Merovingian king with himself and had himself declared king of the Franks, inaugurating a new dynasty, the Carolingian dynasty. Now, he did this with the support of the Pope at the time, a Pope named Zachary. He wrote a letter to the Pope, essentially describing the situation in France and saying, it's not fitting that the one who actually rules the kingdom not be accorded the title of king, and that someone who does not actually rule the kingdom continue to occupy the throne, right? And the Pope wrote back basically affirming this and saying it's fitting that he who rules should also be acknowledged as king. And so Pippin the Short inaugurated the alliance between the papacy and the Carolingian dynasty that would be strengthened with Charlemagne and would be an important kind of long-term outcome of the Carolingians. And it also strengthened that general tie between the monarch of France and the Catholic Church, and in particular the papacy. But this is not an easy relationship. If you consider it on the analogy of a marriage, it's a very, very conflicted marriage with, periods of separation and so on. Because on the one hand, you have this legacy of an alliance between the King of the Franks and the Pope. On the other hand, you have occasionally erupting into a rivalry for basically the office of leader of Christendom. And also you have a rivalry over control of the Church of France, because the kings of the Franks, all the way from Clovis up to like Louis XVI and the French Revolution, all the way through most of the history of the Kingdom of France, the kings of France have had a very strong desire to control the church within France, and especially to dominate appointment of bishops or selection of bishops, and to have access to the revenue of the church at times they need it, and so on. And this comes to become essentially a formalized ideology of church-state relations called Gallicanism. So anyway, again, a complicated legacy. So on the one hand, Pope Zachary supports Pippin's overthrow of the Merovingians. And then the next pope, Stephen II, basically calls upon them for aid. And he needs help against the Lombards, who have gradually subjugated most of northern Italy, replacing the Byzantine administration that had been reestablished by the Emperor Justinian. And the Lombards were harassing the church and carving out territory from the Papal States and so on. So Pope Stephen II appealed for aid to Pippin the Short. Pippin the Short came to his aid and helped him against the Lombards. And then in 754 AD, Pope Stephen traveled to Francia. And he anointed Pippin as king. And he also anointed the queen and Pippin's two sons, Charles and Carloman, as essentially kings in waiting. So there's and then he also conferred the title Patricius Romanorum, patrician of the Romans. So there's a couple of important things here that Pope Stephen did. First of all, this is essentially the origin of the medieval coronation ceremony, and it becomes it's most famously associated with Charlemagne, but it goes back to Pippin the Short. So it is the ceremony of a representative of the church hierarchy anointing the king. And so in this case, it's the Pope, and the kings of France under the Carolingians have this kind of privilege of being anointed by the Pope. But in many cases, it's a bishop. And so it's this part of this gradual transition toward a concept of kingship blessed and sanctioned by the church. And there was some discussion and debate in the Middle Ages about whether the consecration of kings or the anointing of kings was actually a sacrament of the church. And it ended up, the consensus settled on that it wasn't. You could say it's basically a sacramental, not one of the actual capital S sacraments. But this method of anointing the king was used in the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of Canada, in 1953, I believe it was. So, you can actually watch a video on YouTube of a coronation ceremony involving the bishop anointing the queen and handing her symbols of rule and so on. And this is a ritual that basically goes back to Pippin the Short. So that's the first thing he did. He anointed them, and thereby basically gave the papacy's sanction to their rule. But again, he also conferred the title Patricius Romanorum. And so that is the title that was conferred on Odoacer and Theodoric by the Byzantine Roman emperors a couple of centuries before, patrician of the Romans. And it essentially means that he is the vicar or representative of the Roman emperor in the West. Now, it was of limited practical significance. It may be that it mainly just symbolized the fact that the Carolingians were supposed to protect the Papal States, right, in and around Rome. But it's connected with Charlemagne eventually becoming emperor. So just a couple of questions I'll just answer quickly. Charles Martel equals Charles the Hammer. Yes, that's right. Martel, the title Charles Martel means Charles the Hammer. Yeah. And yes, it is given because he was the Hammer of the Moors, basically, because he won the Battle of Tours. Was Queen Elizabeth coronated by a Catholic bishop? No, she was coronated by an Anglican bishop. So the ceremony is basically the medieval ceremony that would have been where the anointing would have been carried out by a Catholic bishop, but in her case it was an Anglican bishop. Okay, so Pippin the Short inaugurates the Carolingian dynasty. Now, after his death, Charlemagne and his brother Carloman become kings of the Franks jointly, right? Again, this sort of partible inheritance. But Carloman dies in 771, and Charlemagne basically decides to, rather than divide up Carloman's portion of the kingdom among Carloman's heirs, he excludes them from the succession and decides to be the sole king of the Franks, and he's recognized as such. So he becomes sole king of the Franks in 771, and he has a very long reign of 45 years, dies in 814. And the first overall sort of theme of his reign that is connected to some other things is his military campaigns. So he was known during his time kind of initially as a very effective military commander. So he spent most of those years of his reign on at least leading campaigns. Just about every year he led at least one military campaign. And some of them were to subdue vassals of the Franks who were in rebellion, like the Aquitanians or the Bavarians. Some of the campaigns were to defeat external threats who were invading and raiding across the borders. The Saxons are the main one of these, but also applies to the Saracens of Spain and the Danes and the Vikings. And then sometimes it was coming to the aid of the Pope, fighting the Lombards in Italy, or attempting to establish essentially beachheads against looming threats or sort of persistent threats. So, yeah, have a map on here. So he went all over Western Europe on these campaigns, and was very successful on the whole. Not a 100% record of success, of course. No military commander has that, but was very successful in securing the submission of the vassals of the Franks, and defeating the external enemies that had been threatening the borders, and extending the territory that was ruled by himself greatly, and eventually united this kind of core of territory basically in and around France and Western Germany and Northern Italy. So the largest boundaries are represented by this red dotted line, right? So all of this became Charlemagne's empire. So a few kind of highlights from these military campaigns. One of the famous ones is against the Saxons. Now, the Saxons were pagans. And one thing that Charlemagne is kind of infamous for is he demanded that everyone who became his subject convert to Christianity if they were not already Christians. And so the Saxons, it was a brutal war on both sides. The Saxons were brutal and very perfidious. They frequently broke treaties immediately after making them. And as kind of punishment, Charlemagne himself resorted to brutalities at times, including executing prisoners of war in order to sort of, again, retaliate for the Saxons breaking their treaties. But he's famous for forcing the Saxons to accept Christianity as a condition of basically being spared and allowed to become his subjects once he beat them militarily. So the interesting thing to point out here, first of all, I think Catholics should know some of these things, at least so that they know how to distinguish true accusations against the church or against Christians of the past from false ones, right? There are lots of false accusations made which should be rejected immediately. Like, for example, if somebody says the Crusades were wars to spread the Christian faith and to convert Muslims to Christianity at the point of the sword, well, that is false. That is not true. That's not what the Crusades were at all. But if somebody says, well, I heard that Charlemagne forced several thousand Saxons to accept Christianity, that is true. But the interesting thing is that this is a very rare exception in Christian history, right? The norm in Christian history is not for Christian rulers to force people to convert. And the church has always taught that people cannot be compelled to accept Christianity. The Inquisition, for example, did not apply to non-Christians. It applied to Christians, right? It was basically based on the principle that if you're a Christian, then you have a duty to publicly adhere to the faith of the church and not attack it or call it into question. But it doesn't have any jurisdiction over non-Christians. So, but again, the point here is that this is an exceptional event. It's very unusual for Christian rulers to have done this. So, defeated the Saxons, fought against the Danes, as you can see here, when some of them invaded, and there were some Viking raids along the North Sea that he fought back against by building a Frankish navy, and there had been no Frankish navy before that. He extended territory of the Franks into basically what's Western Germany, Austria, parts of Hungary, and thereby basically brought those lands within the sphere of Western Europe and began the process of integrating them into Western European civilization and Latin Christianity. And wherever he did this, he encouraged missionaries, monks, missionary preaching, encouraged the establishment of dioceses and bishops, and encouraged monks establishing monasteries and so on. So the Christian faith spread through his encouragement in these lands. Integrated northern Italy into his realm and essentially protected the Pope's territory sort of in central Italy. And then in the south, in one famous campaign in the year 778, he led an army across the Pyrenees into Spain, into Muslim Spain, in order to fight back and recover a stretch of territory which could essentially be garrisoned as a military outpost to prevent Muslim incursions into southern France, right? So this Septimania had been preyed upon by Saracens for several decades. So he established what's called the Spanish March, and march means like again a kind of militarized frontier zone. And it's during this campaign that a very famous event happens in 778. So on the way back through the Pyrenees, while crossing through a mountain pass called Roncesvalles, is it on the map here? Yes, it is. Roncesvalles on the map here. The rear guard of Charlemagne's army was ambushed by some Basque forces. And the Basques essentially resisted being subjected to Charlemagne's rule. And so the rear guard, led by Charlemagne's paladin and friend Roland, was ambushed by this Basque force, and they were all slain. And it became the subject of the famous Song of Roland, which is considered one of the first works of literature in French. It's written a little later, like maybe around 900 or 1000. But first work of French literature, and also one of the great medieval chivalric epic songs. So I love the name Roland, Roland the Paladin. Now, like I said, wherever Charlemagne conquered, he encouraged missionary efforts, and so the blue, the green, and the pink dots basically show the gradual extension of Christianity into German lands, largely with the help of Charlemagne. So, okay, those are his military campaigns. Now, the culmination of his reign, it comes in the year 800, when he's crowned Holy Roman Emperor. So he had a strong alliance with Pope Leo III, and also was very close friends with him. Charlemagne's biographer Einhard writes that one of the few times in Charlemagne's life when he appeared overcome with grief was when his friend Pope Leo died. He was almost inconsolable. So he was friends and allies with Leo III, and in the year 799, Leo had a crisis in Rome where some of the local aristocratic families basically wanted to kick out Leo. They they accused him of tyranny and various other calumnies, and they actually physically blinded him and essentially pushed him off the throne. And Leo fled to Charlemagne's realm in Francia. Charlemagne took him in and then brought him back to Rome and restored him to the throne. And then he in December of the year 800, he had a series of meetings with the local aristocracy and basically succeeded in getting them to accept Leo. And then on Christmas Day in the year 800, when Charlemagne was attending Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo III set an imperial crown on Charlemagne's head, and he was acclaimed as Emperor of the Romans by the crowd in St. Peter's. And Pope Leo essentially did subjection to him as the emperor, as his sovereign. And so Charlemagne is crowned emperor. Now, there's a number of interesting points connected to this, a number of different ways to look at it. First of all, one of the common debates among historians about Charlemagne is how much foreknowledge he had that Pope Leo was going to do this, and whether Charlemagne was actually the one who orchestrated the whole thing or what. Now, I just read an article, a very, very good article on Charlemagne from the New Catholic Encyclopedia, 2nd edition. And the author there basically proposes that Charlemagne was involved in planning this. Like Charlemagne and Leo decided on this plan, and then Leo took care of the actual ritual itself. And he may have caught Charlemagne off guard with the fact that Leo physically placed the crown on his head, because Charlemagne's biographer Einhard says that Charlemagne was so outraged by this that had he known Leo was going to crown him, he wouldn't have gone to Mass that day. And it's a bit ambiguous, because it could be that he was shocked at the fact of being crowned emperor at all, that he didn't want this dignity or what have you. Or it could be that he was shocked by the fact that the Pope placed the crown on his head, because it implies that the Pope is essentially the steward of the imperial title, right? A bit like how Pope Zachary had basically authorized Pippin, Charlemagne's father, to take over the French crown. It implies that Leo can confer the crown where he chooses. And Charlemagne had a pretty elevated view of the sovereignty of the Roman emperor, including like himself, the title that he possessed. So when it came time to decide the succession with his sons, Charlemagne himself, while he was alive, crowned his son Louis the Pious as emperor, right? So he didn't have the Pope confer the crown. Charlemagne treated it as it's his crown to confer. And similarly, Napoleon, when he declared himself emperor of the French, he persuaded or compelled the Pope at the time, I think it's Pius VII, to attend, but then Napoleon picked up the crown and placed it on his own head, right? No ambiguity there about where the authority comes from. So Charlemagne is crowned emperor, and he's basically his position is now that of an equal to the Byzantine emperor, right? The Eastern Roman emperor. And so theoretically, basically, the Western Empire has been revived. Charlemagne is no longer just the patrician of the Romans, the deputy of the Eastern emperor, but is a Western emperor, sovereign in his own sphere, and equal to the Eastern one. And it took some time for the Eastern emperor to actually accept this and officially recognize Charlemagne as an emperor. It was, I think it was around 808 or maybe 812 when the Eastern emperor actually recognized Charlemagne that way. Um, so theoretically it's the revival of the Western Roman Empire, and all through the Middle Ages, medieval people considered themselves to be still living in Roman civilization under an emperor. The actual practical authority of the emperor in the different regions was a disputed point. But in general, medieval people thought the Roman Empire still existed legally and that they were still living in it. So it's a very different outlook on this than what we're accustomed to, with the idea that like Rome decisively fell in 476, etc. But the empire is now called the Holy Roman Empire, right? And so it is an empire sanctioned and blessed by the church, and the emperor rules by the grace of God. And Charlemagne took that title very seriously, that he is emperor by the grace of God, and part of his job is to help his subjects save their souls. It's not just to govern as a secular ruler, but also to help save their souls, to support the church, and so on. Again, the kings and emperors of this Holy Roman Empire are anointed by the church in a semi-sacramental ceremony of coronation. And their sort of role as kings is modeled on that of David in the Old Testament, right? David also was anointed, right? He's the Lord's anointed. And the king in the Old Testament has a semi-priestly status because of his anointing by the Lord. Essentially, he has some sacred character, and he has some ministerial role in the national religion. And so Charlemagne also applied this. And so he took a great interest in the church and sort of appointing good bishops, establishing a uniform liturgical practice, protecting doctrinal orthodoxy, helping and encouraging the education of the clergy and upstanding moral life, and in general encouraging also the sort of Christian knowledge of the Christian faith and upright living by his subjects. So again, it's all part of a different conception of the emperor. Now, from the point of view of historiography, there's some interesting material on this coronation of Charlemagne from a medieval outlook. So, one thing I'm interested in as a Catholic historian is the typical way that we are taught and approach history nowadays is from a basically secular lens, and a lot of the time from a de facto anti-Catholic polemical point of view. And although I think that the periodization, like the threefold periodization of ancient, medieval, and modern, makes a lot of sense from the point of view of a Christian outlook on history. At the same time, it's not the only way to look at history. And in the Middle Ages, when they had, a more sort of thoroughly Catholic outlook and set of assumptions, one of the interesting things about the way they looked at history is, again, first of all, that they thought they were still living in the Roman Empire and not that civilization had fallen. And they tended, when they looked at secular history, to break it up based on the what they called world monarchies or the world empires. So there's this phrase that they used, translatio imperii, the transfer of the empire. And so it's the idea that the Roman Empire was basically the world state that was inaugurated by the Romans. And that state has continued to exist down to their own time in the Middle Ages. But it has been transferred from one people and one kind of home base or headquarters to another over the centuries. So from the Romans, it was transferred to the Greeks with the movement of the capital to Constantinople, in other words, the Byzantine Empire. And then with Charlemagne, so I'm getting all of this from a 12th century writer named Otto of Freising, a work of history called The Two Cities. So from the Greeks, it was transferred to the Franks with Charlemagne. and the Holy Roman Empire was inaugurated. And they thought that one reason for this transfer was that the Greek Byzantine emperors had become supporters of the iconoclastic heresy. So then, in the 10th century, it's transferred from the Franks to the Germans. And we're going to get to this in the next 2 lectures. Otto the Great becomes Holy Roman Emperor of the Germans. And they thought the Roman Empire might continue to the end of time, based on a prophecy in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament that breaks human history up into a series of kingdoms. This is the way it was interpreted by St. Jerome anyway. And it appears to indicate that the Roman Empire is the last of these kingdoms, and so that it might be, again, it might last till the end of time. Now that turned out not to be the case. So, you know, we got to find a different interpretation of that prophecy, at least modify it in some way. Okay, so in the realm of basically secular history, that's an overview of his reign, of Charlemagne's reign, and you can see here the full extent of his empire, and it didn't last much beyond his death. I'm going to come to that in a few minutes. Now, he also succeeded in establishing his central authority over most of this empire, mainly through his own personal influence. So all through his life, he traveled around the empire, holding local courts and personally appointing his local representatives, building up the certain families that were loyal to him, and checking out how things were going in the empire, trying to see that justice was done and administered fairly, and so on. And so there was a very strong personal loyalty to Charlemagne, but it didn't hold together for very long after his death. Now, another element of his reign, which is kind of interesting bit of trivia, is he reformed the currency, and he created the system of currency based on pounds, shillings, and pence, which was, from Charlemagne up until basically the French Revolution, was the normal system of currency across all of Western Europe. But it was abolished with the French Revolution in France as part of their decimalization campaign. And then because of Napoleon's conquests, it was abolished in some other countries as well. But it held out in England until the 1970s. And so nowadays it's most associated with England, but it was Charlemagne's currency reform. So pounds, shillings, and pence, in Latin libra, solidus, and denarius, hence the abbreviations L, S, and D, right? Like why is the English pound symbol this weird L? It's because it's a libra or a livre in French. And then why is the English abbreviation for pence D? It's because it's a denarius or a denier. And unlike the French Revolution currency and the decimal currencies that we use, it's not decimal based. So it's 12 pence to a shilling, 20 shillings to a pound. In other words, 240 pence to a pound. And it's I think it's basically that way because the numbers, you get more, what do you call it? It's easier to make fractions without decimal places using those, right? 10 can only be divided into 2 and 5, but 12 can be divided into 2, 6, 3, 4, etc. So anyway, Charlemagne reformed the currency, gave us that. Now, I said that he traveled around quite a bit, but he did establish his own headquarters and his official throne at the town of Aachen in northern Germany. And he built a cathedral there. He actually essentially built a whole new city with special care about the architecture. And Aachen became an important center both for the court in the sense of the gathering place of the nobles around Charlemagne, where people from all over his empire could come and meet with him personally, but also became the center of a cultural revival that we call the Carolingian Renaissance, or the Caroline Renaissance. Either way, both based on Charlemagne. So the Caroline Renaissance, this is where we get into the emergence of Western Europe from the Dark Age. So it is a renaissance, or a renewal, a rebirth of cultural life, education, literature, and so on in Western Europe that is associated directly with Charlemagne, hence the Caroline Renaissance. And so Charlemagne essentially, he contributed to this in a number of tangible ways. So first of all, he made his court at Aachen a gathering place for scholars from all over Europe. There were, the various regions of Europe had been gradually emerging from the Dark Age through the efforts of bishops, monks, missionaries, and so on. We saw Bede a couple of lectures ago in England, right? So England was on its way out of the Dark Age and was producing great scholars by the mid-8th century. And so Charlemagne made Aachen a gathering place for scholars from all over Europe. And it was given the nickname the New Athens, right? A new Athens has arisen in Western Europe. So just a few of these names. Paul the Deacon came there from Italy. Dungal came from Ireland. And then Alcuin, the greatest of all, was an Englishman. And basically a product of that revival of education in England by Benedictine monks that had also borne fruit with Bede. So there were these and many other scholars who came and gathered in Aachen to meet one another and share books together, and then return to their home countries and attempt to sort of stimulate cultural revival. And Charlemagne also encouraged the founding of monasteries with dedicated libraries and dedicated scriptoria for copying books and so on. So there are other ways also that he contributed to a revival of culture in Western Europe. So first of all, he created this community of scholars. One outcome of this palace school, it's called the Palace School at Aachen, was it became possible again to pursue advanced studies. There had been a certain amount of limited education available prior to in different places prior to Charlemagne, but these scholars began to revive advanced fields of study, advanced intellectual pursuits, and also to revive kind of cultured literature. So there's a lot. Basically, the rest of my remarks tonight, apart from the conclusion when I wrap up with Charlemagne's death, basically the rest of what I'm going to talk about tonight is about the Caroline Renaissance. This is, from my point of view, the most important of his legacies. So, okay, Charlemagne, in addition to creating that palace school, gathering place of scholars, he encouraged education across his realm. And it was at all levels of society. He encouraged education, particularly for the clergy. He wanted the bishops and the local pastors and so on to be well educated in both Christian learning and just in sort of literacy and knowledge in general. But also he wanted education to be more widely available for the general population. And there had been this old Roman tradition of grammar schools and liberal arts-based education. And they had largely fallen into decay during the Dark Ages, but Charlemagne greatly encouraged their revival. And so bishops throughout his realm began to establish schools where poor scholars could come and begin their studies. Many of them would go on to become priests, but it was not limited to candidates for the clergy. And he also encouraged towns and local counts and so on to establish schools as well. And the education system that he encouraged and basically set on a firm foundation for the rest of the Middle Ages was education based on the 7 liberal arts. So there's actually a saying that was I was told about by one of my students. He was French Canadian. He said that the French have a saying, "We can go to school because of Charlemagne," and in important sense, that's true. He basically revived the European tradition of liberal arts education, and it has not broken down. There's not been a break in that tradition since then. So I want to just briefly explain the 7 liberal arts. I'm not going to go into depth because I actually gave a public talk about the history of the 7 liberal arts a few months back, and I recorded that, and I'm going to post that online sometime in the next few weeks when I'm able to get the chance to sort of put the video and everything together. So I'm going to make that available. There'll be a more in-depth look at the history of the liberal arts, but I want to just give you a quick explanation of what they are. So this is a medieval representation of them from a 12th century manuscript. This is another one by my favorite fresco artist, Andrea di Buonaiuto, same artist as painted the series image that I have up in the corner that says under the Church History 10 little rubric. So this one, it has it's 14th century fresco. It has St. Thomas Aquinas in the middle. I'm going to explain this more fully later on when I get to this in the course of church history. But at the bottom, it has this representation of the 7 liberal arts. So the classical scheme that was basically developed by the Greeks and then kind of finalized, put in its final form by the Romans, is based on 7 liberal arts, which are considered the foundational starting point of education. And there's an elementary set of liberal arts and then a secondary set. And Thomas Aquinas, once talking about the liberal arts, he referred to this verse from Proverbs: Sapientia edificavit sibi domum, excidit columnas septem. Wisdom hath built herself a house, she hath hewn her out 7 pillars. Right, so the 7 pillars of wisdom are the liberal arts. And so the primary 3 liberal arts are called the trivium, the threefold way. They're grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. And then the quadrivium, or fourfold way, is the secondary level of education. And they are mathematical disciplines. They're all mathematical. So grammar, shown up here, basically teaches literacy. And in the Middle Ages, under Charlemagne, this meant Latin, right? You learn Latin when you already know how to speak your own language. A lot of the local languages of Europe didn't actually have written forms kind of formalized at the time, but Latin was the international language of scholarship and of learning. It was also the language of most of the Christian sort of catechesis, in terms of books anyway, and the language of the Christian liturgy in Western Europe. And so you start with literacy, learning Latin. Now this is following the order represented in here, but actually the next one would normally be dialectic. Dialectic essentially means logic and critical thinking. So once you know how to read and write, then you learn how to think, argue, criticize, and how to make logically valid arguments. And then with rhetoric, you learn persuasive and beautiful speaking and communication. So it's focused on speaking, but it comes to involve beautiful and skilled writing as well. So this is primary education, right, in Charlemagne schools and in the European liberal arts tradition. The secondary level of education, like I said, is all mathematical. And the order you would normally do it is arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. And these go back to Pythagoras. Pythagoras codified those 4. And Pythagoras is famous for being a rationalist and for believing that the ultimate basis of reality is number, not like matter, right? And so Pythagoras conceived these as arithmetic is the study of number in itself. Geometry is the study of number in space. Music is the study of number in time, right? So essentially rhythm and harmony as well. Harmony was a big part of how they studied music. They approached it mathematically. And then astronomy is the study of number in both space and time, right? It combines geometry with seasonal cycles and so on, and it's very advanced mathematics. So that is the liberal arts scheme of education which Charlemagne revived, and again, basically set that tradition in place, lasted until very recently. It was basically abolished and replaced with what we are used to in terms of modern education system sometime in most places between about 1800 and 1900. It's sort of connected with the Industrial Revolution and modern states and so on. So, okay. There's a medieval little verse that sums this up. Grammar speaks, dialectic teaches truth, rhetoric colors words, music sings, arithmetic counts, geometry measures, astronomy studies stars. Now, another very important element of the Caroline Renaissance is the salvation and propagation of ancient books and ancient literature. So Charlemagne, one of the first things that he did with his palace school was he founded a library. So there was this Charlemagne's Royal Library at Aachen, and he invited scholars from all over Europe to come congregate there, and they brought their most rare, interesting, and precious books often to share with one another and to make copies of them. And Charlemagne collected many of these into the Royal Library. And so the Royal Library around 800 or 810 might have been the most wide-ranging and comprehensive collection of books in Western Europe at the time. And he encouraged the copying of books, and he established, again, scriptoria for the making of copies of these books. And so it is directly because of Charlemagne that much of the literature, especially of the Latin classics, has survived to this day, and it is available to be read to this day. So he was very interested, of course, in the Church Fathers and the early Christian writings, but he also encouraged the collection and copying of classical Latin literature, including like secular literature, works like Virgil and Cicero and so on. So in the year 800, a lot of these books had become extremely rare and only existed in a few copies. And so the copying of these books that was done under Charlemagne in many cases saved them from being lost forever. Now I'm going to come back to this point in a minute. But one thing that they discovered when these scholars from all over Europe got together at Aachen was that they all, even though they were all reading and writing the same language, which was Latin, they all had different ways of writing it in terms of handwriting, right? Their methods of handwriting were different. And so a solution was developed that is named after Charlemagne. It's called Caroline Minuscule, and it was a uniform system of handwriting that was basically, it emanated from Charlemagne's court and was copied and then became the basis of a common handwriting across Western Europe. Now, this also had some interesting historical consequences, but I want to spend a few minutes on this to kind of give you a visual of the background to this and the way that it unfolded. This is an area that I specialized in as a PhD student, the history of what we call script, methods of handwriting in the Latin Middle Ages. So I want to show you some of these. Okay, so this is a couple of samples of Caroline Minuscule, the handwriting method that Charlemagne encouraged. So, okay. The first point to get clear on about handwriting is that it has evolved over the centuries. And you can think of it essentially as a kind of technology. Like writing itself is a kind of technology, right? Writing initially was probably basically pictograms, depicting the objects that you were describing, and then gradually developed into representations of sound through symbols, etc. So handwriting is the same thing. So this is what we call the Roman capital script. It was the way that the Latin language was written in ancient Rome. In this case, these are manuscripts of Virgil from the 4th century AD. So there's a few things you can see about it. One is that it's all in capital letters, right? Another is there is basically no punctuation except for a little dot occasionally. And another is that there is no spacing between the words, right? So all of these things, the distinction between capital and lowercase letters, what we call minuscule letters, punctuation, and word spacing, all of these things were not part of the way that language was written in the beginning of writing. They were developed gradually. They were innovations at certain points. So first of all, that's one element. The other is under the Roman Empire, there was a basically uniform way of writing Latin, at least for kind of serious official copies of books. But another thing to realize is that handwriting changes across time, just like the way that language changes and evolves, right? English has evolved and changed greatly in the past 1,000 years. Handwriting goes through a similar process. People just, they involuntarily or deliberately, they make changes in how they write the shapes of certain letters. Those eventually become essentially established by custom, and gradually at a certain point, you have the emergence of a whole new kind of method of handwriting. So you can see some of this evolution already in this next sample of another kind of script called uncial. If you compare it, you can see this script is very square, and here, especially if you look at the bigger letters, it's much more rounded, has a rounded look, and some of the letter forms have changed. Now this on the right is what's called a palimpsest. So there's a work that was written originally, and then it was essentially washed off and scraped, and then a new work was written over it. But with chemicals, you can get the original writing to reappear, which is what's been done here. This is the sole surviving manuscript of Cicero's work, The Republic. Now, another thing that happened during the Dark Age is that methods of handwriting in different parts of Europe diverged. Because, again, handwriting evolves, and it evolves differently in different regions. And so if those regions are sort of separated, as they were in the Dark Age, then the evolution will take separate paths. And so this is what ended up creating the problem for the scholars at Charlemagne's court. So this is what's called insular script. It's characteristic of the islands of Ireland and England. On the left is an Irish example. On the right is an English one. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels that were made at a monastery not far from where Bede was based. These are some Southern European examples. Visigothic, so from Spain. You can see the very tall, elongated letter forms. And Beneventan, which is from Southern Italy. Now this one has this weird kind of diamond shape. I find it pretty appealing to the eye, pretty beautiful. But you can see it's a very different script from the insular ones. So you have this divergent evolution in different areas. And finally, Merovingian, so the handwriting in France before Charlemagne. On the left is one of the worst samples of handwriting that I've ever seen in my studies of medieval manuscripts. And then on the right is a fairly beautiful one made at the monastery of Luxeuil. And if you're looking at it for the first time, it looks essentially impossible to read, right? Even if you know Latin. When we dealt with this as a sample in my classes at U of T, initially we could read almost nothing, even though we were all good at Latin. But you can learn and you actually can read it. So that reads terra terrenus, Terra, secundus homo de caelo caelestis, qualis terrenus talis et terreni. So you can't, and that's caelestis, Caelestis. You actually can read it, but again, you have to learn it. So the point is, in the 8th century, you have these 3 scripts, and more than these, but just for illustration, you have these 3 scripts, these methods of writing Latin, all coexisting, right? If you're in the islands of Ireland or Great Britain, you write Latin like this, something like that. If you're in Spain, you write it like this. If you're in Italy, southern Italy anyway, you write it like that. If you're in France, you write it like this. And so when these scholars from different parts of Europe brought their books together, they discovered that often they couldn't read each other's books, which is kind of a problem, especially if you want to copy them and kind of, preserve literature and learning. And so they adopted this reformed script called Caroline minuscule. And it's called minuscule because it has both capital letters and lowercase letters, right? You can see in here, the normal script, the normal lines are lowercase, but it also employs uppercase letters. So minuscule also has regular word spacing, which is very useful, makes the book much more easily read and comprehensible. So these are, again, you could consider them basically technological advancements in writing, in methods of writing. But the other thing is, it's a very legible script, and it was applied as, there was essentially a standardization process that Charlemagne encouraged. So all across Western Europe, particularly within the borders of Charlemagne's empire, scholars and scribes writing books adopted this script. And so there was a return to a uniform Latin script, so that books written in one place could be read in another, and you could spread knowledge of literature and literacy all across Europe that much more easily. So a couple more historical points connected to this. First, like I said, Charlemagne's gathering of the library and the royal library, and then his encouragement of book copying, was very important for the survival of ancient literature. And one reason for this is that the few existing copies of some great works of classical literature were several centuries old by this point, and on the edge of disintegration, or easily lost. So for the greatest writers of classical literature, typically the oldest manuscripts that we can find today, that are known to exist today, are mostly from the 8th and 9th century, right? So they were copied under Charlemagne or in the next century after him. And usually if there are, let's say, 10 manuscripts so let's say we're talking Livy's History of Rome, which was written under the Roman Empire. I think 1st century BC or AD. I'm forgetting the dates of Livy. So Livy's History of Rome, work of classical literature. There might be 10 manuscripts that survive from the 8th century that contain this work. And then one survives from earlier than that, from the 5th century. And that's typical with most works of classical literature. If we have any manuscripts older than the 8th or 9th century, it's like 1 or 2 for the most part. Virgil is exceptional, by far the most numerous, and there are only about 4 or 5 manuscripts from before the 8th century. So just as an example of a specific example, Livy's History of Rome, books 23 and the ones after, 23 to about 28 or 30. There is one single manuscript that survives from before Charlemagne, and it has the nickname the Codex Puteanus. So this is it. This is the sole surviving pre-Charlemagne manuscript of Livy's History of Rome. Now this manuscript very probably was brought to Charlemagne's royal library. And around the year 800, a copy was made of it, which is on the right. So this manuscript on the right, we know from historical evidence that this manuscript is a direct copy of the Codex Puteanus. And every subsequent manuscript of Livy's History of Rome that was written in the Middle Ages descends from this copy that was made of the Codex Puteanus. So this is a case, and it's not unique. There are other cases like this, where books 23 and thereafter of Livy's History of Rome would not be available today at all. It would not be possible to read it if this manuscript, the Codex Puteanus, had not been brought by Charlemagne to his palace library for copying, right? And then copied, and it was disseminated throughout the Middle Ages. So even if the Codex Puteanus had disappeared in the 11th century, we would still have copies of Livy's History of Rome. And again, this is not unique. There are a number of works of classical literature that survived basically just by the skin of their teeth because of Charlemagne's palace school and encouragement of book copying. Now, another interesting element of Caroline Minuscule is the fact that Caroline Minuscule is the basis of modern Latin fonts, right? In English, we use the Latin alphabet. So these letters here, this font that I used, Caroline Minuscule, the font that I used in my slides is Garamond, right? It's one of a number of modern fonts and typefaces used for the Latin alphabet, the alphabet we use in English, French, Spanish, Italian, etc. So Caroline Minuscule is the basis of that, of those fonts and modern handwriting. So here's how that happened. Charlemagne established Caroline Minuscule as the standard method of handwriting, but a period of divergence set in again during the High Middle Ages, and these different scripts of the High Middle Ages are called Gothic scripts. So you can see a significant change from Caroline Minuscule with these two samples here. And there was regional divergence again. So Northern Gothic has a different look and character than Southern Gothic, written in like Spain and Italy. So the Gothic scripts became the normal method of handwriting, especially in Latin, during the High Middle Ages. And Caroline Minuscule kind of faded. But during the Renaissance, the humanists of the Renaissance were very interested in finding old manuscripts in European libraries. And so they started digging through all the libraries they could get access to try to find the oldest manuscripts they could. And what they discovered is like 9/10 of those manuscripts were written in a script like this one, right, that looked like this. So they thought that this was the way that the ancient Romans wrote Latin. These, again, whenever they went to find the oldest possible manuscripts, most of what they found looked like this, because most of the oldest books were copied under Charlemagne, right? There were very few surviving books from before Charlemagne. So they thought that this was how the Romans wrote Latin. Hence, as part of their classicism, their attempt to revive classical Greek and Roman culture, they revived this method of handwriting. And so the humanistic scripts that were adopted in the Renaissance, are essentially Charlemagne's Caroline Minuscule handwriting, on the mistaken idea that this is ancient Roman writing. And then, when the printing press was invented in the 15th century, they eventually settled upon this as the basis of the typeface that they used, and hence modern fonts. So Charlemagne also gave us our modern method of writing the Latin alphabet. And you can see comparison here. Caroline Minuscule on the left, humanistic script on the right. Okay, so that's all on the Caroline Renaissance. Now, Charlemagne died in 814. And I want to talk a little bit about his personality, kind of by way of conclusion. So it's very interesting to read the biography of Charlemagne by a medieval writer named Einhard. So give me 1 second here. So Einhard wrote the most significant biography of Charlemagne, and he has an extensive section when he talks about his character. And he's a very interesting person, and like I said, it's fun to analyze him. So Einhard says his body was large and strong, his stature tall but not ungainly, top of his head was round, his eyes were very large and piercing, his nose was rather larger than his usual, he had beautiful white hair. I'm not sure if this means he was actually blonde or what. His expression was brisk and cheerful, so that whether sitting or standing, his appearance was dignified and impressive. Now he goes on to talk about a number of his characteristics. This is available online. Just go to archive.org and search for Life of Charlemagne, and you can download it. Talks about his eating and drinking habits, his sleeping. He didn't sleep very well. He would rise during the night. In his speech, he was fluent and ready, and could express with the greatest clearness whatever he wished. He was not merely content with his native tongue, but took the trouble to learn foreign languages. He learned Latin so well that he could speak it as well as his native tongue, but he could understand Greek better than he could speak it. So he knew a little Greek, but couldn't really speak it. His fluency of speech was so great that he even seemed sometimes a little garrulous. Paid the greatest attention to the liberal arts. Now this is where Einhard talks about his encouragement of the liberal arts education system. He tried also to learn to write, and for this purpose used to carry with him and keep under his pillow tablets and writing sheets that he might in his spare moments accustom himself to the formation of letters. But he made little advance in this strange task, which was begun too late in life. So he was literate. He could read Latin, but he never learned to write. It's one thing in the Middle Ages, kind of peculiar to us, but more people learned to read than learned to write. Writing was basically like a separate skill. And I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? It's a manual skill. So there were people who could read, but they couldn't write. And normally if they were composing things, they would dictate, and secretaries or scribes would write. So he didn't learn to read. He didn't learn to write. He was very pious. He was known for attending Mass daily and praying frequently, and being a major supporter of the church. And again, he took care to try to encourage good men being appointed to the clergy, and encourage bishops and priests to pay attention to their spiritual duties and the well-being of their flock, and so on. He supported churches also, like financially. He built churches, he donated money, donated vestments, and so on. He was devout in relieving the poor. He gave alms, and so on. He was and I think that he also wrote out the barbarous and ancient songs in which the acts of the kings and their wars were sung, and committed them to memory. He also began a grammar of his native language. So he was very intelligent, and by the standards of his time, he was somewhat learned. Now, like I said, it's interesting to kind of analyze his personality. And I would say that Charlemagne, if you're familiar with the four temperaments, the classical four temperaments, phlegmatic, melancholic, choleric, and sanguine, I would say Charlemagne appears to be a sanguine-choleric blend. He was evidently a people person. He was very likable. Like Einhard said, he was fluent in speech. He could even be considered garrulous, right, over-talkative. So he had the gift of gab. He was an extrovert, right? But I would not say that he was a pure choleric. I think Alexander the Great is an example of probably a pure choleric. Charlemagne seems to again, he seems to have had the kind of somewhat flighty, not always, what's the word? Somewhat flighty and prone to passion, and also very attached to socializing, some of those qualities that are associated with sanguines. And I think his sanguine character probably helped him a lot, because he was pretty skilled diplomatically. He was good at making friends, and again, he succeeded in getting his imperial title recognized by the Byzantine emperor through diplomacy, basically. But being a sanguine choleric blend, he was very active and energetic, right? So he had extraordinary energy, which basically sustained him on military campaign. And even when he wasn't campaigning, he loved hunting and swimming. Kept doing those things all the way to the end of his life, even though his doctors recommended that he take it easy. So the other thing about him being sanguine, so he had a large family. He married 5 times. It's complicated, but several of his spouses died. One, he essentially repudiated her, and I think maybe there was an actual declaration of nullity of the marriage and so on. But he married 5 times. He had at least 18 children, and some of them were illegitimate because he had concubines at certain times. And this is another thing. He was known for having concubines in addition to his wives, and that also seems to be a sanguine thing, that he was not very in control of his desires and passions, including his passion for women. But he loved his family. He was very close with his family, and in particular, he kept his daughters always basically at home. And this was considered actually a failing of him as a father, that he didn't let his daughters marry and sort of move out, but kept them at court because he was so attached to them. So he died very beloved in Western Europe, and this is his casket on the right. It's a large casket because he was a big man. I think the estimate is he was about 6 feet tall, which is pretty tall for medieval people. They were smaller generally because of nutrition. And his casket is in Aachen Cathedral, in what I find a totally stunning setting, with that, kind of oriental decor, and then this magnificent stained glass and image of the Blessed Virgin. So he left an amazing legacy, right? He had made all of these positive achievements that I've just outlined. And the longest lasting of them were his contributions to the spread of Christianity and to the revival of cultural life with the Caroline Renaissance, right? Those were the ones that lasted a long time after his death. And basically, they were part of an ongoing trend that lasted into the modern period. But his actual political realm did not last very long after his death. That was where his accomplishment was most fleeting. So he had, like I said, he had a lot of children, but he only had one legitimate son still alive at the time when Charlemagne died. Some of his other sons had died in a short span. It's one of the tragedies during his lifetime, losing several children in a few years. So his one legitimate son that survived him was Louis the Pious, who became Holy Roman Emperor after him. And because there was just the one son, the realm was not divided when Charlemagne died in 814. But Louis the Pious had 3 sons of his own, and when he died, the realm was divided between these 3: Lothair, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German. And a civil war erupted between them. And they ended up settling the civil war by making basically a series of pacts in what are called the Oaths of Strasbourg and the Treaty of Verdun. So these were oaths to respect each other's territory and a treaty to put an end to the civil wars. And an interesting thing about these is that the Oaths of Strasbourg, the document, was written in 3 languages. Gallo-Romance, which is essentially the oldest surviving form of the French language, and in here it's right there, Pro Deo Amor, right, French. Old High German, in Godus Minne, and then in medieval Latin, Sacramentum Autem. So you can see that by the mid-9th century, when these oaths were made, the languages of France and Germany were diverging. Well, first of all, the language of France was kind of emerging out of Latin. It was evolving to become a distinct language. And the language of Charlemagne's German subjects was also diverging. And so you have the beginning of Charlemagne's united realm dividing into the countries of France and Germany. And the division under his sons contributed to this. So the Treaty of Verdun divided it between Charles the Bald, you could say this is essentially France, Louis the German, and again, this is essentially Germany. And then this middle strip here was given to Lothar, and he had the title of Holy Roman Emperor. And so under the grandsons and great-grandsons and so on of Charlemagne, his empire rapidly fragmented, and it ceased to be an actually unified thing. Now, I'm going to come back to this in the next 2 lectures, because I'm going to talk about the 9th and 10th centuries where this all plays out. And the last point on Charlemagne is toward the end of his life, there was one threat that he saw looming on the horizon that he warned his children about, which was the Viking raids in the North Sea. These Norsemen from places like Norway and Denmark had begun raiding along the seacoasts of France and Germany, and Charlemagne had put a stop to this to some extent by building a Frankish fleet, but he thought that this was the looming threat that he feared for the generations to come after him. And we're going to take up right where we leave off here in the next lecture when we talk about the Viking Age. Okay, so let me look at the questions for a couple of minutes and then we'll wrap it up. Were there local kings of regions in the empire or just Charlemagne? Essentially, so there were kingdoms. There were, because there was the title King of the Franks, the title King of the Lombards, but Charlemagne held all of those titles. So Charlemagne was King of the Franks, Charlemagne was King of the Lombards. So once Charlemagne had completed his conquest, there were no like local kings within the empire apart from him, none like rivaling him. But he tended, not Charlemagne. During his lifetime, before his other sons had died, he had kind of parceled out some of these titles to the sons, right? So theoretically, within the realm of Charlemagne, you could have local kings all under the authority of an emperor who's above the kings. And that is more or less what ended up taking shape during the High Middle Ages. Theoretically, the King of France was part of the Holy Roman Empire and subject to the Holy Roman Emperor. But it kind of gets complicated in the High Middle Ages. So under Charlemagne, there was only Charlemagne as king. But theoretically, the way that the empire worked, you could have local kings under an emperor who's above them all. Was the large first letter of a document just used in church documents or other documents too? The large first letter of a document. Okay, so let me go back here and see if I... Oh, pardon me. Let's see if I can explain that. I think I know what you're asking. Okay. So So here we've got an example, the large first letter, right? It's called an initial, just first letter, so the large initial. We've got that here too, and here this here is actually an F. It's just cut off at the top, and then here, Beatus vir in principio. Okay, so these initials, these large decorated initials, were used in all kinds of books, not just church things. And they're part, so again, writing is essentially an evolving technology, right? So one of the important tools in bookmaking is things that help the reader navigate the book and find what he's looking for, right? So they use these to mark out the beginning of new sections so that the reader can quickly find what he's looking for, right? So in this case, on the left, it's the Psalms. So this is the psalm that begins, "Blessed is the man," etc., Beatus vir. And this one is the opening of the Gospel of John. So it's actually a text that we're very familiar with from the Latin Mass, right? In principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum, et Deus erat verbum, hoc erat in principio apud Deum, omnia per ipsum facta sunt, et sine ipso factum est nihil, quod factum est, in ipso vita erat, etc. This is what we hear at the end of Mass with the last Gospel. So yeah, it was used in all kinds of books, part of giving you visual cues to, the beginning of a new section or the opening words of a psalm so that you can quickly find what you're looking for. Yeah, so it was normal part of bookmaking all through the Middle Ages. Okay, now I have time for one more question, if there is one, and if not, we'll call it a day. Any heresies during the time? So in relation to the Eastern Empire, there's iconoclasm, and Charlemagne, the iconoclastic heresy, opposition to images, and Charlemagne kind of resisted that. The one that I'm remembering, although it might not be strictly under Charlemagne, is a debate about the nature of the Eucharist. And I can maybe quickly look that up and come back to that one. But there was a debate during some of these centuries about the nature of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. As far as I know, all parties concerned believed in the real presence. It was just a question of explaining it. And the transubstantiation formula ended up triumphing, sort of becoming the consensus later on. But it wasn't defined dogma at this point. So there was some debate about this. And I believe in around Charlemagne's time, there was a particular explanation that provoked a lot of opposition and condemnation. Ended up eventually being condemned. But can't remember any more details on that beyond that. So okay, it looks like that's the end of our time. So thanks very much. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, I appreciate if you hit the like button. And to the Canadians, happy Dominion Day tomorrow, the birthday of our country. Okay, so thanks for watching. Have a good evening, and until next time, I wish you grace and truth.